Hi, my name is Dan Bordwell, and I'm a teaching and learning specialist for secondary social studies for the Anoka Hennepin School District. My presentation is called Decentering Whiteness, One School District's Approach. The goals of this session are to share examples of how our school district has purposefully taught state standards through different lenses, and to provide examples of how to structure the work and empower teachers. Now, I will say this is not the presentation that I hoped to give when I wrote the proposal in February of 2020. I wrote this for an in person session where we could have an open discussion, where we could explore together, and there would be back and forth feedback and critique where we could learn from each other. And the fact that I wrote this in 2020, I would probably not call this the same session, just knowing what political climate that we are in. But overall, I'm very happy that you have chosen to be part of this session, and I have my contact information at the end of the slide, and I hope that we can engage in a dialogue moving forward. So, to talk about Anoka Hennepin, just to kind of set the context of the work that we'll be talking about, we're just north of Minneapolis. So, again, very sorry that we are not in person and that this is virtual. Otherwise, you'd be here. And if you have a really good arm, you could throw a rock from the convention center and hit our schools. Probably not. It's like 6 or 7 miles away, or southernmost tip. We're Minnesota's largest school district with 37,000 plus students. Just under two-thirds are white, and you can see our demographic breakdown there. About a third are qualified for free and reduced lunch, almost one in five for special ed, and 7% are English learners. We have six traditional middle schools, five traditional high schools, and a slew of other sites as well. And we have nine required social studies courses for our students to take. In Minnesota, all middle school students take Minnesota Studies in grade 6. In grade 7, it's US Studies. In grade 8, it's Global Studies. And then in our high school offerings, we have civics and human geography as one trimester courses each in ninth grade, two trimesters of US history and world history in 10th and 11th grade, and then one trimester of economics and government and politics. And each of those courses have their own honors or AP credit to go with, should students decide to take that. I want to start by showing this image, and I think this is an image that really speaks to the work that I try to work with and convey to the teachers that I support. I support about 140 teachers in those 18 different sites that we have. And in 2019, I was at AERA in Toronto, and I was on a panel or presentation with Charlie Brooks. And in Charlie's work, they took a look at two different teachers taking a look at the civil rights era and what they were teaching. Talia, the teacher on the left, these are all the people that they mentioned when they were teaching US history. So you'd have people that you'd expect: Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ruby Bridges. But then there are some more contemporary people like Colin Kaepernick and Bree Newsom, Barack Obama, and Ellen DeGeneres. So a little bit more intersectional, a little bit more throughout time, more naming of people, whether it's Elizabeth Eckford or Sylvia Mendez or Linda Brown. Contrast that with another teacher just down the hall named Christopher. When Christopher taught the civil rights era, he talked about Earl Warren, Justice Black, Andrew Jackson for some reason, Dwight Eisenhower, a little girl in Kansas, and she. Whenever I am talking about the work that we attempt to do in Anoka Hennepin, I ask people, whose class would you rather be in? Talia's or Christopher's? And to me, it's clear. Talia's class has way more people. It tells a more complete picture of a story. And it's not just talking about one thing, it's connecting and interweaving different things. Whereas Christopher's class is missing a lot. And there's a lot that's invisible in what is being missed in that unit. So, the question that I asked my social studies teachers is, how might social studies in Anoka Hennepin render the discourse of invisibility visible so that our classrooms can be a location of possibility? Now, this question has a lot in it, and it's very loaded. But first of all, it is a question because it recognizes that in order to answer it, we have to be purposeful in how we do that. And how might indicates that there are many different paths that we can do when we're quote unquote doing the work. The discourse of invisibility is something that Gloria Ladson Billings and later Ashley Woodson and others have talked about, in which the discourses are ignored. So think about, as Ashley Woodson talks about, Black lesbians in the antebellum. Most of us know nothing about Black lesbians in the antebellum era, yet there were Black lesbians in that era. And so their discourse is invisible. When we go back to Christopher's class, there's so much that is not included in there. There's so many perspectives that are not even mentioned that it is invisible. So the task that I ask our teachers that I support is how do we render that discourse of invisibility visible? How do we turn those tables so that, as Bell Hooks says, our classrooms can be a location of possibility? And no matter what the political climate is and where you teach, if you talk about our classrooms being a location of possibility, one where all students can see themselves and learn about other people, some windows and mirrors, I think most people, 95, 99% of people, are going to say that that is a lofty goal to achieve. I also want to talk a little bit about our courses to kind of indicate why we're doing this work and how we operate. So in Minnesota, we are currently revising our new social studies standards, and they may or may not be out. A draft of it being sent to the committee process, or rather, rulemaking process. But our last standards were written in 2013. And like most social studies standards, they are there, they exist, pretty heteronormative, pretty white male groups, pretty big picture, but also a lot of minute details, and pretty much exclusion of everyone or everything else. And you could go back through and do an analysis of see what's missing. But in our courses, we conduct writing teams that have one teacher from each building. This is generally done in the summer, but sometimes done on professional development days. What they did after the 2013 standards were released is they went through and they organized the benchmarks and placed them in different units. And within those units, they wrote assessments and came up with daily lessons. They did a lot of UBD, understanding by design, and backwards planning. We've spent time revising that curriculum as we wait for new standards. One of the things that our courses have is we have common summative assessments, or CSAs. That is the district final. And those are multiple choice questions, about 40 to 50, depending on the course, that are written at a DOK level 1 or 2. You might see a couple DOK level 3 courses or questions included in there. But all of our teachers give that final. But from there, it's debatable depending on the course, how loose or tight our curriculum is and what needs to be followed. And as we've gotten further away from the original writing teams, we've lost that institutional memory. So a lot of buildings will organize things how they want to. They'll change learning targets to make them more student friendly for the students in front of them. But ultimately, everyone in our district will take the CSA. So, I want to propose or give to you a brief timeline of the work that we've done in our district. I'm in the fourth year of my job here as the teaching and learning specialist. What I do is I oversee curriculum development and professional development for teachers. I support teachers in whatever capacity they need. I meet with new teachers. I do a lot of onboarding for them. I work with principals if they have questions about our curriculum or if they're responding to parent comments. Oftentimes, I meet with the director of curriculum, who's my direct boss, or an associate superintendent or superintendent to provide them or school board with information about what's happening in our courses. So it's my fourth year, and before I came on the role in 2018, our district, as I mentioned earlier, is teaching off the 2013 Minnesota Social Studies standards that have gaps in them. There's a lot of discourses of invisibility within those standards. So if the standards and benchmarks have that, chances are our curriculum does as well. We made a decision before I came into this role about doing some summer writing. And what we decided that we would do is that all of our courses would have infusion work with them. So we met with Professor Keith Mays, who's from the University of Minnesota in the African American History Department, and he went through and took a look at all of our courses with our teachers and examined and explored ways where we could infuse or add talking about and conversations about race. We also established a new elective called Honors African American History course that's ran in all of our courses. In addition to that, we began the Social Studies Lit project. And what that it was all about is we recognize that our reading scores could always be improved, and a spot where we can get some bang for our buck is a text-heavy discipline like social studies. So we began giving professional development to teachers that offered low to no prep strategies that they could use with their students. So instead of just handing them a textbook, teachers would change their practice and have a purpose for before, during, and after reading. So that's all happening. That's what happens when I come into my role as a teaching and learning specialist. And we started infusing, as I mentioned with Dr. Mays. And what we did is we took a look at all of our learning targets. We did this in the summer, and any teacher who wanted to could sign up. We also did this a couple of times during the school year, and where we were able, this is when substitutes were available, we were able to get subs and bring people in. And we also did this on our professional development days, as we had a train the trainer model where we would have expert teachers talk through the work that they did. So what we did with Dr. Mays and then on our own is we would go and look through our learning targets and find different spaces and talk about how we're teaching it and how we are centering different narratives within those learning targets. So, for example, if we're talking about Brown versus Board of Education, you can easily do the learning target about Brown versus Board of Education without mentioning Linda Brown or her family or the results of the Supreme Court case. We talked through that as teachers and what we wanted to talk about. And we got some areas, and we were pointed in resources by Dr. Mays. And we revised our learning targets to then recenter who we're talking about. We also shifted our focus to be more student centered. And in doing so, we had to think about who our students were who are in front of us on a daily basis. If we were teaching a learning target that didn't connect to our students, we really had to go back to the state standards and benchmarks and say, do we have to teach this? And if it wasn't part of the benchmarks, we edited it out. If it was part of the benchmarks, we would talk through different ways that we could bring this on to the students. Within that, we talked about how we would identify local connections. So, how we would talk about um, gerrymandering and talk about local districts that were gerrymandered. When we talked about redlining, we'd pull up a map and show students where it was. And we have teachers who take kids down the street to go look at houses where neighborhoods have been redlined. So we bring abstract concepts to the local as much as we can. And all of this was supported with our social studies lit project, where we used a lot of supplementary text and reading strategies to get students more engaged with the reading, but also use readings to bring in other voices in our existing curriculum. Now, infusion is great, but if you think about a blood infusion, it's just an add on to the body. So if your body is broken and you have an issue with your blood, an infusion is going to be good. It's better than nothing, but it doesn't necessarily solve the root issues. And that root issue, the question that we keep striving for in our district, is making our classrooms a location of possibility. So some teachers still use the term infusion. I have thought about talking about recentering or using a rightful place, which is just, focusing on the people, the groups that are needed to be talked about when we're teaching. So telling a more complete picture is really what we're talking about. And so even though the title, this is Decentering Whiteness, that's where I was at in February 2020. And I read this article here in not 2200, but in 2020. Apologies for the typo there. And the idea of rightful place is one that came to mind. And I definitely encourage you to take a look at this article if you're going to do this work, because it might shift how you focus on what work you're doing. So when I came into this role in 2018, 2019, we enhanced our professional development. We did a lot of partnerships with local universities and local community groups, as well as state organizations, and brought them in. We continued our consultation with Dr. Keith Mays, and we made district-wide our social studies lit project. In 2019, we brought in Bettina Love to talk to all of our social studies teachers as a keynote, and she talked about abolitionist teaching and the need to do the work. Our district also adopted an equity achievement plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we broadened our social studies lit project beyond strategies. So instead of just having kids, for example, write a 17-word summary, we talked about how we could recenter the actual teaching. So instead of lecturing at kids and say, okay, go write a 17-word summary about what we just talked about, how would a teacher shift their pedagogical practice and make it focused on a text? And a text could be a reading, it could be an image, a movie, a graph, whatever the case may be. And we really expanded what we're hoping teachers do with students and texts on a daily basis. And I mentioned on the previous slide that our district adopted an equity achievement plan. And I want to draw your attention to number 7C and 7D. So part of that equity achievement plan that was approved by our school board was that we needed to provide course offerings to explore perspectives of underrepresented groups in every high school, and enhance course offerings and curriculums to reflect perspectives of underrepresented groups. So one way that we did this was in our 12th grade required course was having an adoption of Just Mercy as a supplemental text. We have a very robust adoption process when we are trying to make something district wide. Our superintendent likes to say it takes us a long time to make change, but once we do make that change, the ship is steered in that one direction. So we try to do this and through our channels, and the work that we're doing. Social studies is one of the leading disciplines in our K-12 scope and sequence that is trying to focus and recenter and give other voices and perspectives, because they're not only going to benefit the students of color, they're going to benefit all the students. I speak as an alumni of this district. I got a 5 on the AP US history test. I didn't know what Juneteenth was until a couple years ago. I didn't know what the Tulsa race riots were until a couple of years after that. And I didn't know until about 2 years ago that no, they're not the Tulsa race riots, they're the Tulsa massacre, right? We keep learning, we keep evolving, and there's a need for this for all of our students in our system. Then 2020. It was a year that happened. And not only was it a year that happened with COVID, but it was also a year of teaching at home and having families sit at the computer next to their students, listening to what teachers were talking about. We were in the midst of a very polarized election, COVID, all those things. So we edited down our curriculum, and in doing so, we said focus on connections that students can make. We also shifted our professional development to be asynchronous and have synchronous options as well. So each of our asynchronous PD that we offered had teachers to opportunities to watch videos, listen to podcasts, or read readings. And shout out to Social Education and TRSE and Justice for Learning, formerly Teaching Tolerance. They were a lot of the articles that we used. The podcasts that we used a lot of were Visions of Education. Shout out to Dan Krutka, another Dan with a great beard who's attending this conference right now. All that to say, this 2020 and into 2021 hasn't made this work easy. We've seen more resistance from our community. We have teachers who are walking on eggshells, worried that they're going to have a picture taken by a student or parent, that they are going to be unfairly targeted for the work that they're doing as they're recentering the narratives. And so we've given support to teachers. We brought in Dr. Rebecca Cooper Geller to do a webinar with me to talk about how to think about talking about race, politics, and other quote unquote controversial topics, and bring that to the forefront of what we do and questions that teachers should consider, because there isn't a how to manual on this. We provided trainings to our principals to give them support, to know what to expect that their social studies teachers are doing, and a whole lot more. But this work is ongoing. So where we're going next with this work is we have a 4-phase adoption process coming up that we will follow in our district once we have new social studies standards. If you have an opportunity, I definitely encourage you to take a look at whatever latest draft is on the Minnesota Department of Education's website for their social studies standards, whether it is draft two, which here on November 1st is the draft that's released, or hopefully soon, it's due any day now, it's overdue actually, the rulemaking draft that will go to an administrative law judge moving forward. Those social studies standards are really an improvement over the 2013 standards, and they will offer us more opportunity to continue doing this work, but do so in a way that better aligns to state benchmarks. There's a whole lot more that I would love to share with you, but there's still more work to be done. And I'm sorry that this is such a brief overview and talking very fast at you, but I do want to make this as collaborative as we can be. And so does my dog. That's Brisbane. He really loves doing this work. In fact, he, as I was putting together these slides, put his head on my shoulder to, help and support. So instead of this being a one-way street of me talking at you, I'm more than happy to engage with you. We can Zoom, we can do a meet, we can talk via email. My email address is on here, and so is my Twitter handle as well. Sorry that this is so brief. It is not what I intended when I wrote this out in 2020, but hopefully we'll be in person in Philadelphia in 2022. Other than that, I hope you have a great conference, and I hope to hear from you. Thanks.